The desert has always had a way of swallowing men whole. Its endless expanse of sand and rock, the way the sun turns the horizon into a shimmering, treacherous mirage. It doesn't forgive mistakes. And yet, in the year 1890, a series of terrifying reports would emerge from one of the most desolate stretches of Nevada's desert. Reports so bizarre, so horrifying that historians, skeptics, and travelers alike would struggle to comprehend them. Stagecoach drivers, men hardened by years of surviving the harsh western trails, began claiming encounters with creatures unlike anything documented, beings they described only as the lizard people, dwelling in the hidden caves scattered across the desert. Some said it began as an isolated tale, whispered around the dwindling flames of campfires. But over the course of several months, nearly half a dozen stagecoach drivers reported the same kind of encounter: shadowy, humanoid figures, scaly skin that shimmered in torchlight, and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness of Nevada's most unforgiving canyons. These reports weren't the ramblings of frightened townsfolk. These were men who had spent their lives navigating some of the most dangerous terrain in the American West. And yet, they returned pale, trembling, and unwilling to speak beyond simple, hushed warnings. The first entry in this bizarre chapter of Nevada's history came from Jedediah "Jed" Carson, a man known for his unshakable nerves. Jed had been driving the stagecoach between Elko and Austin for nearly 15 years, often through stretches of desert so isolated that weeks could pass without seeing another soul. On the night of April 14th, 1890, he reported something that would haunt him until his death. "I saw them," he wrote in a letter to a fellow driver, "figures in the caves, watching, waiting. They didn't move like men, but they moved with purpose, and they knew I was there." It was a chilling account, one that at first was dismissed by local lawmen and town historians as the fevered imaginings of a man alone in the desert. But as more letters and journal entries surfaced, a disturbing pattern emerged. The sightings all took place near isolated caves, often at the base of cliffs that were nearly impossible to scale. The drivers reported the same unsettling details: low hissing sounds that echoed through narrow canyons, sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature, and the feeling of being watched by eyes that seemed to glow from within the shadows. Nevada's desert in 1890 was no ordinary place. Winters were bitter, with icy winds sweeping across salt flats and rock formations, while summers turned the sands into a near-blinding expanse of heat. Water was scarce, and the land offered only the most minimal shelter. Isolated stagecoach routes were particularly dangerous. Bandits, sudden storms, and the unforgiving desert itself were enough to break even the most seasoned traveler. But the stagecoach drivers who reported the lizard people weren't just frightened of natural dangers. They spoke of something intelligent, lurking, and undeniably predatory. Among those who encountered the creatures was Samuel Griggs, a young driver who had recently started on the Elko-Austin line. Samuel had grown up hearing tales of strange desert phenomena. Miners spoke of ghost lights dancing along ridges, and old prospector legends told of cave-dwelling monsters. He laughed off these stories, believing them to be the sort of exaggerated warnings designed to scare newcomers. That is, until his third journey into the canyon, when he claimed he saw the figures with his own eyes. According to Samuel, he had stopped near a narrow pass to water his horses. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the rocks into deep orange and black shadows. That's when he heard it, a low, sibilant sound, like air escaping through a slit in stone. At first, he thought it was the wind, until the hissing grew louder, closer. Then he saw the eyes faint, glowing orbs reflecting his lantern's light from deep within the cave. A shape emerged, upright, humanoid, but unlike anything he had ever seen. Its movements were deliberate, almost preternaturally smooth, and the skin caught the lantern light in scales that shimmered with a strange, greenish hue. Samuel bolted, urging his horses into a panicked gallop. But the memory of those glowing eyes, watching from the shadows, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And he was not alone. Over the next several months, reports surfaced from other drivers, encounters with similar figures, cryptic footprints in the sand leading into cave mouths, and strange symbols etched into the stone walls, carvings that looked almost reptilian, or hieroglyphic in some unknown language. For historians, these accounts presented a puzzle. Was it mass hysteria among exhausted men traveling alone in a harsh desert? Or had something genuinely unusual been hiding in Nevada's caves, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? Some speculated that these so-called lizard people were a lost indigenous tribe, evolved to survive in extreme isolation, while others leaned toward the supernatural creatures that predated human memory, lingering in the hidden folds of the desert, emerging only when they sensed intruders. The geography of the area made it plausible that something could remain hidden for centuries. Nevada's desert is riddled with caves, cliffs, and narrow passes, many of which are accessible only with climbing experience that few stagecoach drivers possessed. In addition, the desert's isolation means that even the boldest explorers would sometimes spend days without encountering anyone. For creatures adapted to this environment, the desert could serve as both refuge and hunting ground. Jed and Samuel, along with other drivers, began forming small, informal networks of communication. They exchanged letters and notes, warning each other of particular canyon areas, advising others to avoid certain caves after dusk, and describing the sounds and shapes they had witnessed. Some claimed the creatures could mimic human voices, luring travelers closer to the cave entrances, while others swore they had seen unearthly shadows move across the walls as if alive as winter approached. The desert grew even more dangerous. Freezing nights, biting winds, and the threat of snowstorms made travel nearly unbearable. Yet even in these extreme conditions, stagecoach drivers continued their routes, often out of necessity. And in that cruel silence, punctuated only by the clatter of hooves and the wind's mournful whistle, the lizard people seemed to thrive. The harsh Nevada desert in late November of 1890 had already claimed a handful of careless travelers, but the stagecoach drivers had always considered themselves untouchable. Seasoned men, hardened by months of sun, wind, and sandstorms. That sense of invincibility, however, would be shattered the night of December 3rd, when Jedediah Carson himself faced the first undeniable encounter with what he later called the lizard people. Jed's route took him through a narrow canyon known as Devil's Hollow, a stretch notorious for sudden rock slides and the occasional bandit ambush. The moon had been swallowed by thick clouds, leaving the desert in near total darkness, illuminated only by the flickering lantern at the front of the stagecoach. The horses snorted nervously, their hooves crunching on the gravelly sand. As Jed guided the carriage deeper into the pass, it began as a faint noise, almost imperceptible over the clatter of the wheels. A soft hissing, like wind over a fractured stone, drifting from a side cave just off the trail. At first, Jed ignored it, assuming it was the usual echoes of the canyon. But then he saw them shadows slithering along the jagged rock edges, moving in a way that no human or animal could replicate. He froze. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the path was narrow, and the horses sensed his hesitation. The shadows began to take form, tall, upright figures, hunched slightly, with limbs bending at odd angles. Scales shimmered faintly in the lantern light, a greenish hue that seemed to absorb the glow rather than reflect it. Then the eyes appeared, small, slit pupils glinting in the dark, fixed upon him with a predatory focus. Jed described it later in his journal. I could feel their gaze on me, sharp and cold, as though they could see into my very thoughts. The air grew thick, almost wet, and my lantern flickered as if the shadows themselves were consuming its light. I faced rattlers, wild coyotes, even armed bandits, but nothing compares to the dread that crawled into my bones that night. The figures didn't attack immediately. They watched. Jed could hear the faint scratching of claws on stone, the subtle hiss of breath that wasn't human. It wasn't until the stagecoach crested a small rise, exposing the mouth of the cave fully, that one of the creatures slithered down toward the trail, moving with a speed that defied the laws of nature. The horses bolted instinctively, yanking Jed into a frantic ride through the canyon. The lizard people following at a distance, always just out of clear sight, their hissing echoing from the shadows. By the time Jed reached the relative safety of an open plateau, the figures had vanished. The desert returned to its usual silence, leaving only the clattering of the stagecoach wheels and Jed's ragged breathing. But the memory lingered, embedding itself into his mind with terrifying clarity. He later confessed that he had lost track of time, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, and the experience left him questioning his own sanity. Word of Yet's encounter spread quickly among the drivers' network. Few were willing to speak openly in town, fearing ridicule or disbelief, but letters, notes, and whispered conversations told a pattern of increasing fear. Samuel Griggs reported another strange sound on his return. Journey, a wet, dragging noise in the sand, accompanied by fleeting glimpses of figures retreating into the caves. Harrison Dale, a driver who had avoided Devil's Hollow entirely, claimed that his horses became inexplicably spooked near another canyon entrance, refusing to move and trembling despite no visible threat. Thomas Reddick, a stagecoach guard, swore he saw symbols etched into the canyon walls, markings that resembled a twisted, reptilian alphabet. These seemingly isolated incidents began to form a pattern, a growing web of dread that no man could explain. The desert itself seemed to conspire, hiding the creatures in shadows, using its geography as a natural camouflage. Drivers reported feeling a presence, an intangible awareness that they were being observed even when no figure was visible. Nighttime became particularly terrifying. Long stretches of darkness, punctuated only by the distant hissing, the echo of claws, or the glint of reflective eyes. As winter deepened, incidents grew more alarming. One driver, Elijah Monroe, claimed he discovered footprints near a cave mouth, humanoid in shape, but with clawed toes, webbing between them, and a length far exceeding any known human. The tracks were damp, as if the creature had emerged from an underground water source, and they vanished suddenly into a narrow crevice, too small for a man to enter. It wasn't just the sighting of creatures that unnerved the drivers. It was the psychological toll. Sleep became difficult. Men reported nightmares, waking to find shadows moving across their camp tents. Some swore they heard whispered voices mimicking the accents of their friends or family, calling them toward dangerous canyon edges. A subtle paranoia took hold, and for the first time, Stagecoach drivers began doubting their own senses. The reports also carried hints of intelligence. The creatures didn't attack indiscriminately. They observed, tested, and retreated. One driver recounted leaving a dropped lantern near a cave entrance, only to return hours later to find it carefully propped upright, as though examined and returned. These were not mindless predators. Something in the desert was studying them, learning their patterns, exploiting fear as a weapon. By December 15th, letters from multiple drivers converged on a disturbing conclusion. The lizard people were territorial, cunning, and possibly growing bolder. Routes that had been safe for years suddenly became dangerous. Regular stops near caves were no longer optional. They were harrowing gambles. Drivers began traveling in groups when possible, or avoiding night travel entirely, and yet, as the fear intensified, so too did the desert's silence, broken only by faint, indecipherable sounds from the cliffs. Some drivers swore that in certain caves, the air itself seemed alive, as though breathing, waiting. Others noted a strange resonance, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground, unsettling both men and animals. The first incident had passed, leaving no physical scars. But the desert had claimed something far more insidious, the psychological terror of the unknown. Stagecoach drivers were no longer merely facing the harsh elements of Nevada. They were being hunted by something older, something alien, and perhaps something undeniably intelligent. By mid-December of 1890, the stagecoach drivers had begun piecing together something far more disturbing than simple desert encounters. The reports, journals, and letters they exchanged painted a picture of creatures that were not only real, but deeply intertwined with the land itself. Old-timers in Elko whispered of desert legends that predated the first miners and settlers. Stories passed down by the Washoe and Shoshone peoples spoke of Siwat, a race of reptilian humanoids said to dwell in hidden caves and subterranean passages. They were guardians of certain sacred lands, beings who existed alongside humans only in shadow. According to the legend, the Siwat were cunning, territorial, and capable of mimicking human behavior to lure intruders into the depths of the desert, where few returned. Drivers like Jed and Samuel, initially skeptical of such folklore, began to see disturbing parallels. The behaviors described in their encounters matched the legends, observation from hidden vantage points, often in near-total darkness, eerie hissing and whispering, sometimes mimicking human voices, symbolic carvings in cave walls, representing an unknown, possibly written language, the apparent ability to vanish and reappear at will, suggesting an intimate knowledge of subterranean passages. One particularly chilling account came from Harrison Dale, who had ventured closer to a cave in Devil's Hollow than any driver had dared. He discovered markings etched deeply into the stone walls, elongated, geometric shapes resembling a cross between hieroglyphs and reptilian anatomy. The carvings appeared deliberately directional, almost as if guiding intruders deeper into the cave system. Harrison described a sudden realization. This isn't just a warning. It's a trap. As the driver's awareness grew, so too did the frequency and intensity of encounters. Several incidents in late December suggested the lizard people were no longer content to remain hidden. Samuel Griggs, during a rare night off, returned to one of the caves to retrieve a misplaced package. He reported being stalked by two figures, their glowing eyes following his every step. He claimed that when he froze, they paused as if assessing him, then retreated slowly into the darkness, leaving him shaken but unharmed. Jed Carson described a close encounter where he saw 3 humanoid shapes scaling a cliff with unnatural agility, disappearing into a fissure too narrow for a man. The sound of their claws scratching on stone lingered long after, echoing through the canyon like a malevolent chorus. Elijah Monroe found strange footprints surrounding his stagecoach camp, arranged in a circular pattern, suggesting the creatures were capable of coordinated movement and strategy. These escalating events left the drivers terrified, but also determined to understand what they were facing. They began carrying extra lanterns, weapons, and makeshift protective charms, though these offered little reassurance. Night travel became nearly impossible, and many routes were avoided entirely until spring lightened the desert's grip. It was during this period of tension that the midpoint revelation truly crystallized. According to the journals, there seemed to be an organized hierarchy among the lizard people. Jed noted observing one figure taller than the others, with markings more intricate than any he had seen before. This figure appeared to coordinate the others, pausing and gesturing subtly, movements Jed described as eerily human, yet grotesque in their angularity. In addition, the lore hinted that these creatures had emerged from subterranean networks, connecting the caves with hidden reservoirs and abandoned mining shafts. Some legends suggested the seawort could survive for extended periods without sunlight, drawing sustenance from unknown water sources, or perhaps from the very desert itself. The stagecoach drivers began realizing the terrifying possibility the creatures could have lived undetected for centuries, evolving in isolation, and observing humans without ever being discovered until now. This revelation only heightened the tension. Each journey became a test of nerves, a gamble with unseen watchers lurking in the shadows. Drivers reported hearing strange hissing choruses echoing from multiple caves simultaneously, as if the creatures were communicating with one another. Lanterns would flicker unnaturally, and winds would shift suddenly, carrying faint whispers that sounded almost human. One particularly harrowing escalation occurred when a small convoy of 3 stagecoaches traveled through Devil's Hollow simultaneously. Witnesses later reported that a shadow passed over the convoy, blotting out moonlight as if a dark cloud had descended. The horses panicked, kicking and whinnying, and one driver claimed he saw figures moving along the cliff face faster than any man could climb. Remarkably, no one was physically harmed, but the psychological trauma left all 3 men trembling. Unable to sleep for days, the drivers began keeping meticulous records. Noting patterns, the lizard people appeared most active in the colder months, particularly during long nights with low cloud cover. Their behavior seemed methodical, even ritualistic, as though they were testing boundaries, marking territories, or attempting to communicate in ways humans could not comprehend. By the end of December, the desert had transformed into a stage of slow-burning terror. Every canyon, every cave, every shadowed ridge became suspect. Stagecoach drivers carried not only letters and ledgers but anxiety itself as a companion, aware that even the smallest lapse could bring them face to face with something utterly alien. The midpoint of this historical nightmare was clear. The lizard people were no longer mere sightings or folklore. They were active participants in the desert ecosystem, creatures with intelligence, coordination, and possibly centuries of evolution in isolation. The stage was set for an inevitable escalation, as drivers could not avoid these territories forever, and the creatures seemed to be growing increasingly bold and deliberate in their interactions with humans. By early January of 1891, the winter desert of Nevada had become a realm of dread for anyone traveling the stagecoach routes. The lizard people were no longer an occasional threat. Their presence had become persistent, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. Stagecoach drivers spoke of moments when they could feel the creatures watching from cliffs, caves, and shadowed gullies, as if the desert itself had turned hostile. Jed Carson's encounters grew more frequent. During a treacherous night near Crescent Canyon, he reported seeing figures perched like statues along cliff edges, their scaly bodies catching faint light from his lantern, making them appear almost otherworldly. The hissing sounds became louder, more urgent, echoing back from multiple cave mouths. For the first time, Jed realized that the lizard people were coordinated, as if several individuals were acting in unison to observe or even herd him along the canyon path. Other drivers reported similar incidents. Samuel Griggs narrowly avoided disaster when a creature apparently mimicked the voice of a friend, calling him toward a cliff edge. He later described the experience as a sound that was not a voice, but not entirely something else either. A chilling blend of human intonation and hissing undertones. Elijah Monroe discovered small, sharp tools near a cave entrance, unlike anything humans would leave, suggesting intelligence and an ability to manipulate objects. The tools were crafted with delicate precision, hinting at a society hidden deep beneath the desert surface. Harrison. Dale returned from a scouting trip to find his horse missing, only to spot footprints leading into a cave too narrow for a man. He claimed he heard the animal whinny faintly from within, as if being observed or herded by the creatures themselves. These events marked a significant escalation. What had once been fleeting sightings were now calculated interactions, with the lizard people testing boundaries, experimenting with human reactions, and asserting territorial dominance over the desert. Drivers were no longer just frightened. They were actively being hunted and studied. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one expected to survive unscathed. Jed, driven by a mixture of fear and stubborn determination, decided to venture closer to the deepest caves in Devil's Hollow, hoping to document or at least confirm what the lizard people truly were. Armed with a lantern, a rifle, and a heavy walking stick, he set out alone one frigid night, aware that every step could be observed, every sound analyzed as he approached the mouth of a cavern that the locals called the Serpent's Maw. He noticed the unmistakable carvings, again geometric patterns that seemed to pulsate in the flickering lantern light. The air was thick and damp, carrying an almost tangible scent of mineral and decay, mixed with the faint, musky odor of reptilian skin. Jed could hear movement deep within the cave, subtle shuffles that suggested creatures pacing or circling him, unseen but undeniably present. Suddenly, he felt it, a cold, wet brush along his arm, almost like a whisper of touch. He froze, heart pounding, and the hissing escalated into a low, guttural chorus, echoing from multiple directions. Lantern light revealed glimmering eyes, reflecting like tiny emeralds in the cave's shadowed recesses. Jed realized then that he was surrounded not by one or two figures, but by several, their bodies partially hidden, their intelligence evident in the way they positioned themselves, each watching, analyzing, waiting. This night marked a turning point. The encounters were no longer accidental. The lizard people were initiating contact, testing the boundaries of human presence in their territory. Jed barely escaped, retreating with his horses in a panicked rush, but the experience left him shaken to his core. His journal entries describe a sense of inescapable dread, The realization that these creatures had lived undetected for centuries and could, at will, manipulate, stalk, and intimidate anyone who dared to enter their domain. Meanwhile, the other drivers were also experiencing heightened threats. Samuel and Elijah reported strange formations of rocks at night, resembling ceremonial or ritualistic structures, which vanished by daylight. Horses refused to cross certain passes, despite careful coaxing, as if instinct recognized an invisible danger. Shadows flitted unnaturally along cliffs, sometimes just at the corner of vision, vanishing the moment eyes focused. Even townsfolk noted a peculiar unease, distant, hissing echoes carried by the wind into settlements at night, leaving a sense of menace that no human could fully explain. The escalation was relentless, psychological as well as physical. Sleep became impossible for many drivers. Even during the day, they felt watched from the cliffs, their nerves frayed by the constant sense of observation. Horses would bolt unexpectedly, tools would go missing, and whispers, faint and unintelligible, seemed to drift across the desert. The lizard people were no longer content to remain hidden. They were asserting dominion over their territory, teaching humans a painful lesson about the limits of their control. Jed's notes hint at a foreshadowed confrontation, one that would test every ounce of courage, skill, and sanity. He began marking areas of cave entrances, noting possible escape routes and patterns in the creature's behavior. But the more he learned, the more he realized these beings were adapted perfectly to the desert, capable of outmaneuvering, outthinking, and perhaps even outlasting humans. Any misstep could be fatal. The sense of inevitable confrontation grew stronger. The creature's intelligence, coordination, and calculated movements suggested a climactic encounter was unavoidable. A night where the hunters and the hunted would finally collide. Deep within the caves of Devil's Hollow. It was a moonless night in mid-January, 1891, when Jed Carson finally ventured into the deepest cavern of Devil's Hollow, determined to witness the lizard people firsthand. The air was thick with cold and damp, carrying a metallic scent that made every breath feel heavy. His lantern barely illuminated the jagged walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed almost alive from the very first step inside. Jed felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. A low, guttural hiss echoed from deep within the cavern, vibrating off the stone and reverberating through his chest. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, but his curiosity, or perhaps his obsession, pushed him forward. The first encounter came quickly. A shadow detached itself from the wall, gliding silently toward him. Jed's lantern revealed a humanoid figure, its skin glistening with scales, eyes like molten emerald, and claws tipped with razor-sharp precision. Its movements were deliberate, almost predatory, as if testing the intruder. The air grew warmer, strangely humid, carrying the faint sound of something slithering across the stone floor. Jed froze. The figure stopped mere feet away, tilting its head in a motion that was disturbingly intelligent, almost human. It let out a series of low hisses, which echoed unnaturally, creating the illusion of multiple presences surrounding him. Then another figure emerged from a shadowed crevice, followed by a third, and then more, 6 or 7 humanoid forms, all observing, silent but undeniably aware. Panic surged, but Jed forced himself to move slowly backward, trying to avoid sudden movements that might provoke them. One of the creatures advanced, its eyes tracking him with a chilling calculation, while another climbed the cave wall with inhuman agility, disappearing and reappearing closer with each moment. The cavern seemed to close in around him. Rocks shifted underfoot, making him stumble, and the hissing crescendoed into a mocking symphony, echoing in the narrow passages. Jed realized with dawning horror that he was no longer merely being watched. He was being hunted at the peak of the confrontation. Jed found himself cornered near a narrow chasm. The lizard people encircled him, their movements precise, coordinated, and almost ritualistic. Their glowing eyes reflected the lantern light, creating a kaleidoscope of green and gold across the cavern walls. Jed's heart raced as he fumbled for his rifle, but the creatures didn't attack immediately. Instead, they paused, tilting their heads, hissing softly, as if deciding whether he was worth the effort in a desperate bid. Jed swung his lantern toward one of the creatures. The sudden burst of light caused it to recoil slightly, and in that moment he seized a narrow passage leading deeper into the cave. The creatures pursued, but Jed's knowledge of the tunnels allowed him to slip through fissures that the lizard people could not easily follow. He emerged hours later, near a hidden plateau, shivering and gasping for air. The creatures did not pursue further, but the echo of their hissing followed him across the canyon, lingering in the cold night wind. Jed knew that he had survived by sheer luck and knowledge of the desert, but the encounter left him forever changed. The climax was not only physical, but psychological. Jed documented the following observations. The lizard people were intelligent hunters, capable of coordinated strategies. They possessed superior agility and strength, able to traverse terrain impossible for humans. Their behavior suggested a ritualistic or societal structure, hinting at a civilization hidden beneath the desert. The encounters had an inescapable psychological impact, inducing fear, paranoia, and hallucinations. In essence, the confrontation revealed that these beings were not merely monsters, but an entirely unknown species, perfectly adapted to their environment, and far more dangerous than any human threat the drivers had previously encountered. Jet's survival was a tenuous one, a narrow escape from a predator that was both alien and terrifyingly intelligent. He returned to his fellow drivers with a pale face and trembling hands, warning them that the desert was no longer a neutral landscape. The lizard people had claimed it as their own, and anyone traveling alone or unprepared risked becoming part of their shadowed world. By the end of January, it was clear the winter desert had shifted from a place of harsh natural beauty to a realm dominated by unknown hunters, creatures whose motives, intelligence, and origins were impossible to comprehend. The lizard people had escalated their presence, demonstrating that they were both cunning and patient, capable of observing, learning, and striking when humans least expected it. The stage was set for the ultimate realization. The desert was not empty, and some corners of the world hid truths too terrifying to ignore. By February of 1891, the Nevada desert had begun to thaw, but the psychological cold left by the lizard people lingered long after. Stagecoach drivers who had survived the harrowing winter reported deep unease, even when traveling along familiar routes. Though some attempted to dismiss the encounters as hallucinations brought on by isolation and exhaustion, the consistency of the reports left little room for skepticism. Jed Carson, Samuel Griggs, and a handful of other drivers became the de facto chroniclers of the desert's darkest secret. Their journals, letters, and whispered testimonies painted a vivid, chilling picture. The lizard people were not merely legends, but active, intelligent beings perfectly adapted to their environment. They had demonstrated patience, strategy, and an uncanny ability to manipulate fear, traits that set them apart from any ordinary predator. As the desert thawed, many drivers altered their routes permanently, avoiding the caves and canyons that had become hunting grounds. Some abandoned their livelihoods entirely, unable to bear the mental toll of isolation amid unseen watchers. Horses, too, seemed to retain an instinctive memory of the danger, balking near cliffs and fissures that had previously been routine passages. Yet even as drivers resumed a semblance of normal travel, the sense of permanent observation never fully dissipated. The hissing, though less frequent, could still be heard carried on the wind at night. Footprints, claw marks, and faint impressions in the sand reminded survivors that the creatures remained, always just beyond human sight. Historians later noted that these events, though largely undocumented outside driver correspondence, reflected a deeper truth. Some corners of the world are inhospitable not merely because of natural danger, but because something unseen has claimed dominion over them. The lizard people, whether a remnant of prehistory or a parallel evolution in isolation, were an enduring presence, a shadowy civilization hidden beneath the surface, asserting quiet but undeniable control over their desert territory. For Jed, the winter of 1890 to 91 left an indelible mark. He described in his journal, "I have returned to sunlight, but the darkness of those caves follows me. I see the eyes in shadows, hear the hissing in the wind, and feel the weight of their patience pressing upon me. They do not hunt to kill, not always. They hunt to remind us that the desert belongs to them, and we are merely passing through." Even decades later, the echoes of that winter would persist. Travelers reported similar sightings, faint hisses, and glowing eyes deep within Nevada's caves. Some dismissed these as superstition, others as echoes of a primal fear rooted in the desert itself. But for those who had faced the lizard people firsthand, there was no doubt the creatures endured, lurking just out of reach, watching, learning, and waiting. The desert, for all its beauty and peril, had a secret, and it was a secret that humans were never meant to fully understand. And as one final haunting note in Yet's chronicles reminds us, when you travel the desert alone, and the wind carries a hiss too deliberate to be the wind, remember this: you are never truly alone.